President Trump's second term has become a defining test of presidential authority, pushing the boundaries of what a president can and cannot do under the Constitution. This era has thrust constitutional questions into the national spotlight, forcing Americans to confront the very foundations of our government and the principles that guide it. Bold executive actions, ranging from military operations abroad to deploying federal forces at home, have ignited fierce legal battles over the limits of White House power. Each move has sparked debate not only in the courts, but also in Congress, the media, and among citizens across the country. These are not just political disputes, they challenge the very structure of our republic and the balance of power between the branches of government. The outcomes of these battles will shape how future presidents interpret their own authority. The administration argues for broad, inherent authority under Article 2, claiming a presidential duty to protect the nation that doesn't always require congressional approval. Supporters say this flexibility is essential in times of crisis, allowing the president to act swiftly and decisively. Critics warn this approach threatens checks and balances, state sovereignty, and international law. They argue that unchecked executive power could erode democratic norms and set dangerous precedents for the future. We'll examine two major test cases, each with far-reaching implications for the presidency and the nation's legal framework. The first is the controversial military raid in Venezuela to capture Nicolás Maduro, which raised urgent questions about the president's power to use force abroad without explicit congressional approval. The second is the deployment of National Guard troops to U.S. cities over local objections, a move that tested the boundaries between federal and state authority and sparked intense debate over civil liberties. By dissecting these events, we'll uncover why these legal battles are so critical for the future of presidential power and the rule of law, and what they mean for the enduring strength of American democracy. Article 2 of the Constitution is the foundation of presidential power, yet its brevity leaves much open to interpretation. The vesting clause grants executive power to the president, fueling arguments for broad authority, especially in crises. As commander-in-chief, the president directs the military and shapes foreign policy, while the take care clause mandates faithful execution of the laws. This flexibility has sparked centuries of conflict between the executive, Congress, and the courts. Today's controversies center on whether these clauses empower the president to act independently or require congressional and judicial oversight. The Trump administration claims these powers justify decisive action to protect American interests. Supporters see this as fulfilling constitutional duties. Critics fear it risks an imperial presidency. The debate over Article 2's meaning is more urgent than ever. In January 2026, a U.S. military and law enforcement raid in Caracas captured Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro, shocking the world. Maduro, brought to New York on federal charges, declared himself a prisoner of war, framing the operation as an act of war and sparking international outrage. The Trump administration defended the raid as a law enforcement action, with the military providing security for federal agents. This legal framing aimed to justify the operation under the president's authority to enforce U.S. law, sidestepping the need for congressional approval to wage war. Critics argue this sets a dangerous precedent, violating international norms and risking retaliation. The administration insists the president can act to apprehend fugitives abroad if they threaten U.S. interests. The Maduro case now stands as a landmark test of how far presidential power extends beyond America's borders. The outcome could redefine the limits of executive authority in foreign affairs. The legal foundation for the controversial Caracas raid is known as the President's Power of Protection, an inherent authority claimed by the executive branch to defend the nation and enforce its laws, even far beyond U.S. borders. This power is not explicitly written in the Constitution, but has been interpreted by some as a necessary tool for safeguarding American interests and citizens wherever they may be threatened. This legal theory is rooted in the president's dual roles as commander-in-chief of the armed forces and chief law enforcer. It draws heavily on a 1989 Justice Department memo by William Barr, which argued that the president could authorize extraterritorial arrests, even without the consent of the host country, if it was necessary to protect U.S. interests or enforce American law. The memo set a precedent for future administrations to consider such actions within their legal reach. Decades later, the Trump administration revived and expanded this argument, insisting that the Caracas raid was a law enforcement operation rather than an act of war. Officials claimed that the mission's primary goal was to apprehend suspects and uphold U.S. law. not to engage in military conflict. Military involvement was presented as essential to protect federal agents executing what the administration described as a lawful arrest. The presence of U.S. troops was justified as a security measure, not as an escalation to armed conflict, blurring the lines between military and police roles. Critics, however, argue that this represents a dangerous and unprecedented expansion of executive power. They warn that it risks erasing the crucial distinction between war and law enforcement and could set a precedent for future presidents to bypass legal and constitutional checks. Opponents caution that this doctrine could allow presidents to use military force abroad without congressional approval, as long as the action is framed as enforcing U.S. law. This raises serious questions about the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. Now, the courts are being asked to determine whether this broad power of protection truly justifies such far-reaching actions, or if it oversteps constitutional boundaries. At stake is a fundamental question for American democracy. Who ultimately decides when and how the United States uses force abroad, the president acting alone, or Congress as a co-equal branch of government? The constitutional clash isn't limited to foreign policy. It's playing out at home over the deployment of federalized National Guard troops. In 2025, the Trump administration sent National Guard units to Democrat-led cities to protect ICE agents, sparking fierce resistance from state and local leaders. Governors argued this violated states' rights and escalated tensions, insisting local law enforcement could handle the situation. The administration cited federal law, specifically Title 10, claiming the president can federalize the Guard for national missions if states won't protect federal officers. States sued, arguing the administration hadn't met the legal threshold to override governor's authority. This set up a major legal showdown over the president's power to deploy troops domestically. The core question: when does enforcing federal law justify infringing on state police powers? The courts are now tasked with drawing that line. The outcome will shape the balance between federal authority and states' rights. In a swift and highly publicized move, the Supreme Court intervened in December 2025, issuing an emergency order that temporarily blocked President Trump's use of federalized National Guard troops. The decision came amid mounting legal challenges and intense national debate over the limits of executive power during times of domestic unrest. The court's order required the administration to exhaust all options with regular military forces before turning to the National Guard, especially when a state's governor objected to federal intervention. This procedural safeguard was intended to respect state sovereignty and prevent federal overreach. Many saw this as a victory for states' rights, believing it would slow down or limit the president's ability to deploy troops domestically. However, the ruling also set off a chain reaction of unintended consequences that few had anticipated. By restricting the use of the National Guard, the court inadvertently nudged the administration toward the Insurrection Act, a much broader and more controversial legal tool that grants the president sweeping authority to deploy the U.S. military within the country's borders. Legal experts and critics quickly warned that the court's logic, while well-intentioned, could actually make it easier for the president to invoke this powerful statute, bypassing the very checks the court hoped to reinforce. The Insurrection Act, rarely used in modern times, allows the president to send the U.S. military to suppress rebellion, restore order, or enforce federal law when local authorities are unable or unwilling to act. Its broad language has long been a source of controversy and debate. As a result, the national conversation quickly shifted. Instead of focusing on the National Guard, attention turned to the possibility of full-scale military intervention in American cities, a scenario that alarmed many across the political spectrum. Administration allies began to hint that invoking the Insurrection Act was on the table, especially if violence against federal officers or property continued to escalate. The White House signaled it was prepared to take unprecedented steps if necessary. With each new development, the stakes of the domestic power struggle rose dramatically, leaving the nation on edge and uncertain about what might come next. The Insurrection Act, dating to the early republic, gives the president extraordinary power to deploy active-duty military forces within the U.S. It's a rare exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, which bars the military from domestic law enforcement. The act's broad discretion lets the president decide when unrest or resistance justifies military intervention. Often with little oversight, courts have historically deferred to presidential judgment, making such actions hard to challenge. Congress has no formal approval role, leaving the president as the sole decision-maker in a crisis. Critics fear the act could be used to suppress dissent or override state authority, not just quell genuine insurrections. The debate over the Insurrection Act is a debate over the ultimate emergency powers of the presidency and their potential for abuse. The military raid in Venezuela and the deployment of troops in U.S. cities may seem unrelated, but both rest on the same legal theory: the president's power of protection under Article 2. The administration claims this power justifies acting abroad to apprehend fugitives and at home, to protect federal agents, even over state objections. In both cases, the president is cast as the ultimate guarantor of federal law enforcement, empowered to use force wherever necessary. This approach collapses the distinction between foreign and domestic threats, treating both as challenges the president alone can meet. Supporters see a coherent vision of executive authority. Critics see a dangerous expansion of unilateral power. The courts must now decide whether this unified theory holds up under constitutional scrutiny. The answer will shape the presidency for years to come. The legal battles over Trump's use of Article 2 powers are defining moments for the presidency. The outcomes will set precedents that shape executive authority for generations. If the courts endorse a broad power of protection, the presidency will become more powerful, but with fewer checks. If they impose limits, it will reaffirm Congress's role and state sovereignty, but may constrain rapid executive action. Either way, this era will be remembered as a turning point in American constitutional law. The assertive use of executive power has forced a national reckoning with the ambiguities of Article 2. The answers forged now will define the relationship between the president, the people, and the law for the future.